Welcome to Face to Face. Tonight I'm speaking with Ingmar Lee. Now, Ingmar is a longtime environmental champion who has, from the Nanaimo watershed and iconic Cathedral Grove to the urban sprawl of Victoria and seismic blasting threat to the sandhill crane nesting habitat, always stood up to stay the destructive hand of industry and work to enlighten the ignorant as to the great dangers facing this corner of the Pacific's ecosystem. Welcome back to Victoria, Ingmar.
Thanks, Chris. Nice to be here.
Well, Ingmar, now you're based up in the Great Bear rainforest on the mid-coast of BC. All this controversy about the pipelines, the western reaches of this great tar sands project, they really all come down to protecting the ocean here. Now, for those not familiar with the environment here and the lay of the land, can you describe the area where you're living now?
Well, where we're living near Bella Bella on the central coast of British Columbia is really in the geographical heart of the Great Bear Rainforest. It's right in the middle of it. It's an area of relatively contiguous, intact, primeval rainforest that's about the size of Denmark. And, it's 10 minutes from my house, you're into grizzly bears and wolves and whales, and it's just a virtually intact ecosystem. One of the final places where the culmination of biodiversity has reached its greatest flourishing. It's a very, very special and very, very important place, and there's nothing left like it anywhere in Canada. That's for sure.
Well, that would describe this whole coast a couple hundred years ago. And I know we've talked before, and you said the one thing you noticed coming down here by sea is the lack of wildlife. Now, we celebrate it here. We see otters and seals and seabirds, and we think it's quite a lot. But to somebody living up in your neck of the woods, it seems rather like a desert of a sort. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, having been involved in, silviculture work and subsequently environmental work on Vancouver Island, the general statistics of Vancouver Island, 150 years of logging, took them 120 years to cut half of the forests of Vancouver Island, a half of the primeval forest, took them about 30 years to cut the rest of it. We've got 12% protected, 6% of which is above the tree line, rock and ice. So essentially about 6% of Vancouver's island's magnificent primeval rainforest is protected. We're talking forests of the stature of the California redwoods. They're just absolutely, utterly leveled and devastated. And what people are only just perhaps beginning to be aware of is that the second pass has been just absolutely voracious. The logging corporations have cut their way through successive layers of forest, starting with the oldest and the biggest. All the 100-year-old trees are gone, the 80-year-old trees are gone. They're just cutting their way through right down to what you see going down the island these days, 30-year-old pecker poles on the logging trucks. You might get a 2x4 out of them. They're logging the trees that I've planted myself, so pretty voracious and heartbreaking. And for a primeval forest lover, there was only one place to go, and that's the so-called Great Bear Rainforest. I don't really like that name. It sort of excludes the human element, and it should be noted that human history goes back near where I lived, around Namu. The archaeological digs, Canada's oldest archaeological site, goes back 14,000 years. There was people there before the forest. So, as the top dog in the ecological hierarchy, my contention is that the human element is an essential and very important part of the evolution of that ecosystem. And now, I think the forest mourns for the loss of its human element. It's, there's people are very much almost not in the forests up there anymore. So.
Well, the context has changed. I mean, there's more people, a different kind of people, and then the machinery and everything else. And the focus has changed off of the interior on the coast. I've been up there myself. Everybody lives within a couple hundred meters, it seems, of the water, and hardly any roads or anything else.
Yeah, and very few people actually, go out into the forest very far. Most of the the activity is, like you say, just around the waterfront kind of thing.
Well, when you're saying that they're cutting now on Vancouver Island, cutting trees that you planted. Now,
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't mention this in the intro, but you worked for years as a tree planter. I think in a previous interview you said you planted something like 1 million trees yourself.
Yes, I planted trees for 21 years in British Columbia, and I planted 1 million trees, and I've supervised the planting of about 10 million trees in my tree planting career.
Well, when you and I first came together was, if memory serves, it would have been around 2001 or 2 maybe, and you were then doing a campaign because in the Nanaimo watershed, owned by a logging corporation, they were depositing these chemicals right into the watershed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's it's amazing. I'm glad to see that there's still an increasing momentum. On Vancouver Island, lots of people are working to wrestle the control of their community drinking watersheds away from these giant logging corporations, which are certainly not caring for those watersheds with a priority for drinking water. I mean, you look at the city of Nanaimo. Its watershed has been utterly gutted by industrial logging. It's the highest concentration of logging roads anywhere in British Columbia. Virtually no regulation. There's not a stick of old growth left in there. We're seeing extinctions. The Vancouver Island marmot, for example, is a denizen of the Nanaimo community drinking watershed, and it's extinct. I mean, you'll hear the government propaganda. They've got a captive breeding program going, and every year they sprinkle a few captive bred marmots out on the marmot meadows up there, and but there's no wild-born marmots. These are all lab rat marmots, and
become quick prey for other of the remaining species.
Yeah, and then of course they manage that by having such horrific ideas as going up there and shooting the golden eagles and cougars and wolves and that sort of thing that prey on these marmots. So just terrible ecological consequences. And I think that if people have a vision, the city of Nanaimo's not going away, or the city of Victoria for that matter, or any city. If people think, well, what are you going to do in 2, 3, 4,000 years? Is that city going to just destroy its supply of drinking water? I mean, it's ludicrous. Those watersheds should be entirely protected. They should be devoted for its primary and single purpose of providing drinking water in perpetuity. And right now, the management vision is just absolute logging.
Well, I don't know that there is a management vision. And when you say thousands of years, I think, have we even planned for hundreds of years around here? I mean, we've only been here 150 years, and you look, and as you mentioned, the damage we've done already.
Yeah. The current. I don't even want to call them governments, but the Stephen Harper regime and the Christy Clark regime, it seems to be managing for the election cycle. There's no vision for the future, no vision of Canada. It's just absolute cut and run, grab everything you possibly can, flog it off, make the biggest buck for your corporations that put you in power, and that's it. That's what it's all about these days. So.
Well, and they have in their employ, these governments and the corporations too, these armies of scientists and accredited people who go out and they say, well, what we're doing is okay, it's sustainable, we won't cause any long-lasting damage. They write long papers and almost incomprehensible outlines, and yet here we are, and they go forward and create this havoc.
Well, I mean, it's clear that the science can be bought that proves that black is white, and I know that even giving science that much credibility isn't big up on Harper's agenda, but I don't have a lot of confidence in scientific processes as being able to provide the kinds of real applicable solutions to any of the catastrophes, the ecological catastrophes that we're facing. There's just if you want to put it in order of magnitude, I think right now the Fukushima disaster is only just getting started. I mean, we've only just we've got Fukushima radiation right here on the coast. It's in the fish, it's in the seaweed, it's in the air. There's hot particles as we speak. We're breathing hot particles from Fukushima that will lodge in our lungs and eventually cause cancer. There's virtually no discernible international recognition of this disaster that could pollute the entire northern hemisphere. I don't want to get into the Fukushima details. I'm not really on top of it, but it seems that in the next month or so they're going to try to remove the fuel rods from the blown up, destroyed. One of the reactors has a gigantic swimming pool on the top of it that contains the plutonium fuel rods, and one mistake in extracting those rods, and it's going to make Chernobyl look like a little picnic. I mean,
and Chernobyl's not even finished yet either. I mean, everyone has buried it literally, but it's been buried in the public consciousness. And yet, we hear now that, well, we're not out of the woods with Chernobyl either. And this was in the middle of the 1980s. I mean, in Fukushima, it's been broiling for 2.5 years now.
Yeah.
And with no sign that they're going to get on top of this, and just now getting ready to take those rods and relocate them, because it's never been done before.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a criminal problem. I mean, I contacted Perry Kendall, the BC Chief Medical Officer, and said, why aren't you providing us with at least updates? Why are you monitoring and recording and documenting and disseminating the results of radiation testing here on the coast? And he says, it's not even on the radar. We're not even worried about it. Well, I think that's the height of irresponsibility. There's a very clear problem, and I think it's absolutely reprehensible that not one single level of government in Canada is talking about the Fukushima disaster. So
there was testing in the early days of Fukushima. There was readings given, and then all of a sudden they just disappeared. Environment Canada stopped doing it. No other government picked up the slack, as you mentioned. But there are groups, individuals that are buying little Geiger counters and setting up a network right now to study this. But we've seen collapses in the ocean environment around here. The sardines, or you say the pilchards?
Yeah, the pilchards. That's a very local issue specific to one of my major concerns. That are happening right now. I mean, the seine fleet came back without having caught a single sardine, as they call it. Well, in British Columbia, they're known as pilchards. I've seen, just 4 years ago, just massive runs of pilchards on the coast. I don't know. Nobody knows what's going on with the pilchards and what's causing the lack of fish this year, but all kinds of incredible, bizarre cycles. There was massive pink salmon runs this year. All the creeks were just loaded up. One river where I've been working over the last year there was such a massive pink run going in there. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. But then we have other runs where they've just completely dried up, the Sockeye and the Fraser River and that sort of thing. Just terrible pre-spawn mortalities and all kinds of disaster.
Well, and down here, the herring is also in trouble, and yet the DFO is getting strange numbers saying that they can go out and catch. They're still allowing commercial fisheries to go out, even though the herring, if you listen to somebody like Bryony Penn, is in serious trouble down here, and of course it's a cornerstone species.
I think if people really want to begin to get an understanding of the depth of corruption and incompetence of the Stephen Harper Department of Fisheries and Oceans, they need to watch the Salmon Confidential video that's just been produced by Twyla Roskovich and Alexander Morton and those people. And You can see these DFO officials caught out in outright lies, before the Cohen Commission and all that sort of thing. Department of Fisheries and Oceans is just a scandalous scam organization. It's suppressing its own science, muzzling its own scientists that are reporting these terrible fish diseases that are beginning to show up on our coast.
Well, I interviewed Silver Don Cameron he's down east on the East Coast there, and he referred to DFO as an evil organization. It's a truly evil organization, he intoned to me. But it really points to the commodification of everything here in British Columbia. I mean, when you mentioned Salmon Confidential, Twyla's film, of course, details salmon farming here. And this effort to create these artificial industries and put them in situ with wild systems. And the DFO is employed to tell us that there's no conflict there, that there's no counter effect of this. And yet we see these massive pre-spawn die-offs, which I'm not sure how the DFO explains them or if they've even tried.
No, I have no confidence in the DFO, even if they could explain it or tried to explain it, that there'd be any honesty in it. It's clearly that their mandate is just to make sure that the fish farm business grows and expands and takes over the BC coast. For all intents and purposes, it appears that they're intent on destroying the wild salmon and replacing it with, fish farm fish.
Well, the ocean environment here, the environment generally in British Columbia, but the ocean environment especially, it really triggers a visceral response in a huge segment of the population, more than the people that carry the signs at the legislature 4 or 5 times a year to protest this outrage or the other. Mm-hmm. But is this idea that we can erase the salmon, is this a way, I mean, I've heard it say it's a way that once it's lost, then the people who care about the sea will just say, okay, well, it's all gone now, and they'll let the industrialization, the tar sands and everything else carry on because there's essentially nothing left to protect.
Yeah, it's a mentality that is so foreign to my way of thinking, and it's a constant conundrum for me because in the world that I live in, there's not a single person that I've met out of the thousands of people that I know that would have voted for Stephen Harper or Christy Clark. And it's just absolutely incomprehensible to me that our country, our people, Canadians are basically stupid enough or lackadaisical enough to allow the kind of corruption and basically dictatorship that we've got here in Canada that allows for these organizations like the Harper Conservatives to form a majority government with less than 30% of the vote. I mean, that degree of corruption and gerrymandering of our electoral system is outrageous. It's a kind of corruption that would be, you'd expect in a so-called third world country. And yet Canadians, I think, are just too comfortable, too fat, too cushy with their life, too entrenched in their day-to-day routines to get off their ass and get rid of these creeps.
Well, and ill-informed. I mean, the media in the country is the most concentrated in the Western world.
Well, I mean, that's one thing about the corporate media I'd really like to bring out, because it used to be, as an environmentalist, that it was a very big priority that you planned your actions around being able to generate corporate media coverage and interest. And it was a big part of all the efforts was media management, like how to get the media out to your events. So we'd create, really flamboyant, colorful tree sits and that sort of thing and, get the media out. But the corporate media has become so irrelevant now because the progressive movement has its own media. I mean, I don't go to the Vancouver Sun to get the news. I mean, nobody I know does. It's absolutely irrelevant. I mean, the CBC, and I call that as certainly corporate media. I mean, you listen to the insidious framing of the pipeline issue, and all that sort of thing. Nobody I know goes to the corporate media, and it's irrelevant to the environmental movement now. We've got critical mass. We've got I believe, a very clear majority, and people are are onto it. And I think anybody who goes to the Vancouver Sun or the CBC to get their news and believes that that's the reality of the world isn't worth wasting your time on. Like, we don't need to do advocacy anymore to try and bring people on side to the environmental movement. I think if in 2013, if people are not aware of the very critical ecological catastrophe that befalls us on this planet, if they're not aware of that yet, it's not worth wasting one's time on them.
Well, I wonder even if the majority came along and even got active, as you've been, building tree sits, blockading roads, if it would make a difference. We've just seen, just this last week in New Brunswick, the mainly indigenous protest against fracking, which brought out the paramilitary, the RCMP, not only, in their usual form of bully-boying on the streets, in front of blockades, but this time something that I can't remember ever seeing in this country, even at Oka, where they ringed this area with camouflaged snipers.
Yeah, it's like, Gustafson Lake, they had, snipers actually shooting into the crowd. But I just listened to Evan Solomon, the House, this morning, and even Chris Hall, the CBC National Affairs reporter, which is, just a Stephen Harper lackey of the worst order. Even those people were already on message as, describing the RCMP as just looking like a bunch of goons and oafs and having their snipers and just moving in with tear gas and assaulting those people. And I just want to put a big shout out to the Mi'kmaq in New Brunswick and the Maritimes, and just know that the entire progressive community of Canada, a very clear majority of people, recognize the outrageousness of that pig assault, and nobody was fooled by it. I think the Harper government's worst worry is the environmental opposition to its fracking, pipeline, tanker agenda, and they see it as a very serious threat. I know that, in the States, the NSA and the Homeland Security and everything has identified so-called eco-terrorism as its second biggest domestic
green is the new
threat.
red.
That's right. And so they are freaking out about any kind of tangible, visible opposition to their agenda, and they just come in with blunt brute force, and it just makes them look stupider and more idiotic and more outrageous and more corrupt than ever. The RCMP clearly acting on behalf of the giant oil interests that control New Brunswick.
And, well, they control Canada, too, I would argue, as well. And, as outrageous as this is, and as juicy a bone to jump on, the RCMP, that is, I mean, underlying it is the actual problem, which is the fracking. The fracking that's going on, great guns here in British Columbia, up in the northeast, and they're moving out, committing other outrages in the northwest, barreling onto people's property without permission and cutting trees and taking samples and everything else, I mean, then there's the TPP, the pipeline that's forgotten.
Mm-hmm. Just to bring it back to the Great Bear Rainforest, I'm afraid I'm not really I don't really understand. I mean, I'm aware that in northeastern BC and the fracking issues and all that sort of thing, but in my neck of the woods and where I live up on the Central Coast in Haltzik territory, which is one of the coastal First Nations that have live in the middle of the Great Bear Rainforest. The issues there are the all-consuming issues. The issues, I mean, if you walk around Bella Bella and you look in every single window, there's no pipelines, no tankers. I mean, it's a unanimous opposition on our coast. It's like anybody who comes up there, or anybody who goes out on a boat, even here around Victoria or in BC, anybody who's ever been to the beach or taken a walk in the woods knows that, this whole Harper oil menace is going to destroy it, and people are unanimously opposed to it. There's a unanimous opposition. I've been working down in the Kauai River area over the last year, which is on Fitzhugh Sound, and it's just opposite Hackeye Pass. And from Hackeye Pass, the ocean swells just roll right in across, and they pile up on the cliffs above where I work. And we've been building some cabins right on the edge of the cliffs. And as we were working this year, we witnessed the arrival of the great migration of humpback whales. It's an incredible thing. Every year, literally hundreds of these humpbacks show up, and very, very little is known about these animals. And basically in June this year, we were working on the edge of the cliff, and we looked down and saw very huge bubbles suddenly appearing on the surface of the water just below us, about 50 feet offshore. And suddenly the bubbles began to form a very clear circle. A large, 50-foot in diameter circle in the water. The bubbles kept coming up, and I'm familiar with what's about to happen. So I called over my buddy and I said, look in the middle of the circle, and sure enough, two humpbacks came up with their mouths wide open. You could look right down their throats, and all their pleats, their throat pleats were bulged out like bullfrogs, and they just come up very slowly, and the fish are jumping out, and all the baleen and everything. And so for the next 2 months, we had these daily displays of breaching and just all the joyful humpback antics. They're very exuberant whales. They throw their entire 40, 50 tons right out of the water, completely out of the water, and huge splashes and tail slapping, and mothers with calves and all that sort of thing. And then suddenly in August, the gillnet fleet shows up, and there's about 30 or 40 gillnetters, and between Quay and Namu, there's a fishing zone, and they set up all their nets perpendicular to the shore. I was using my sailboat to get to and from work, and I showed up for my week of work and had to run the gauntlet through all these gill nets. Well, sure enough, they netted a whale. And the humpbacks apparently don't echolocate. The orcas can see the nets somehow, and they swim around them, but the humpbacks seem to just swim right into them. And sure enough, the humpback got into one of the nets, and then what they do is they roll and they thrash and they get wrapped up in the nets, and their flukes get tied right up to their body, and it's a really serious problem. And so I became very concerned about this and quite outraged that clearly, anybody who would have known the Department of Fisheries and Oceans must be aware that Fitzhugh Sound is an enormous whale destination. I mean, there's literally hundreds of humpbacks that show up in there. And especially on that coast between Quacum Inlet and Quay and Namu, this is where these humpbacks come to feed. And it was just the height of irresponsibility to set up a fishery right in that area. So I got a hold of DFO and I said, what's going on here? You've got a humpback in the net. What are you going to do about it? What's the consequences of that? Well, the guy who's their marine mammal specialist, Paul Cottrell, told me, well, actually we caught 3 whales in that fishery. And so what he does is they go out, they get called up, they fly up from Vancouver or whatever, and get out in a Zodiac, and they have a method called kegging, where they throw, Scotchmen and stuff like that into the net trail and gradually wear the whale out and exhaust it to the point where they can hook on their boat to it, and then they get towed around by the whale, and they gradually kedge themselves closer and closer to the whale, cutting off big chunks of net until hopefully they're able to cut the whale loose. So I started researching this, and I think the viewers might be quite shocked to go and look on YouTube, for example. There's hundreds of examples of whale entanglements. Turns out everywhere these humpbacks go, they're being caught in fish nets, and they show up with, on the coast even. Mr. Cottrell told me that they find them towing big chunks of American nets. They're getting netted in the Sea of Cortez on a very frequent basis. Off Australia, they get netted. South Africa, they're getting netted. And it's just a rampant problem. And as I've learned, there's not only whale nettings going on in Fitzhugh Sound off of our area, but all over Camano Sound, a bunch of whales get netted, and then up and around Prince Rupert, and even in Kitimat, they got a whale. And it seems that this fishery just goes on, and they just catch whales, and that's the end of it. That's just part of doing business. And I think there's probably a considerable amount of whale nettings that go on where the fishermen just winch the whale right up to the back of the boat and cut off as much net as they can salvage and just leave them to their own defenses. And one of the most heartbreaking of those videos that I've seen is where there's a pod of 7 whales all tangled up together in a great big net, all just completely exhausted, and they're just floating on the surface. The mother whales, of course, the calves are trying to stay close to their mother, so if the mother gets netted in the whale, then she starts rolling, and then the calf gets rolled up in the net, and the calves are dead. So this one group of whale rescuers went in and cut loose. First, they go in and cut the dead calves off and just let them go. And then they actually got in the water and just went and were able to release the 5 female whales and let them go. But, how many are not being rescued? It's just a very serious issue, and I want to bring that up just to illustrate the absolute incompetence and carelessness of the Stephen Harper Department of Fisheries and Oceans. This, this issue of the whale nettings just demonstrates the absolute careless attitude of these people. One of the very biggest complaints about, the LNG tankers and all that sort of thing, these tankers make a phenomenal amount of noise underwater. And it's a very common complaint in all of the JRP processes for the joint review panel to bring the dirty oil out to the coast. Very significant and recognized complaint about the business is that the noise is just horrific and would seriously disrupt the whales and that sort of thing. So to pretend to come up with a workaround for that problem and then just ignore these whale nettings, it just demonstrates the absolute careless.
Well, does DFO not have a process where if not the department itself, then a way that it can contract with local residents to do rescues and such? Well,
the whole whale rescue thing, I'm very concerned about it, and I want to get myself into a position of getting the equipment, the kegging equipment, to start dealing with that myself if I can. I think there should be a position, some full-time position to go around the gillnet fleet and at least to begin to, these are intelligent creatures. They can, I think that there needs to be some effort to train them away from these dangerous situations or something, but there's nothing at all. And so it seems that the whole whale rescue is a very quiet in-house problem.
Well, this is taking babies out of the stream, downstream, but the fishermen upstream, the fishermen, they know this area, they know what they're doing on the sea, presumably. Are they is it just because the resource says the whales go where the fish are, and so we see the whales, well, that's where the fish are, and that's where we're going? There's no prohibitions against getting within a couple of kilometers or whatever of a feeding school.
There doesn't seem to be any care or consideration at all. I don't know that the whales are necessarily going after the salmon, but perhaps the salmon are concentrating because there's other kind of feed the whales are going after. But I think that netting a whale, you should lose your license. It should be that, or something. It's just unacceptable. If the British Columbia public had any idea of the scale of this problem and how many of these whales are suffering this absolutely dreadful death, there'd be some action. But I think the powers that be are keeping it really under the table. And from everything I've been researching, the problem is enormous. And I hope to expose that.
Well, I mean, this is the media table too. If they can keep it quiet, and this is where I disagree. I think that there is a role to be played by the corporate and state media still. But I mean, we just announced, Mr. Harper's proxy in Parliament that he had prorogued yet again, delivered the throne speech the other day. I think the first time in the history of this country the Prime Minister didn't bother to show up for his own party. But in it, they announced the beginnings of the end of the CETA process. This is a huge so-called trade, but really more of an investor protection deal with the Europeans. When you see these fishers here netting whales, are these all locals or are there international fleets coming out here? Because the CETA deal has the people in fishing, clapping their hands, saying that this means that we can utilize our resource for export more thoroughly to Europe. I'm wondering because the sardines and the Pritchard. Well, it's going to be sardines to Europe if if this goes through. But do we know, are these all local fishers involved in these whale captures, or are there foreign ones?
Yeah, I mean the gillnet fishery is a BC fishery. I don't think there's any international fishing going on inside BC waters. There was a few seine boats in there as well. It's definitely a BC issue,
made in
but
Canada.
Made in Canada, and just the provincial environment ministry doesn't seem to have any clout whatsoever on the fishing business. It's just a federal responsibility, and it's a DFO. I don't know what the solution is. I don't want to blame the fishermen or the fishers. I think they just go wherever the openings are. But whoever is placing those openings and deciding when the fishing goes, these are criminal people that are absolutely callously allowing that fishery to take place in such a obvious whale area. I think it's absolutely criminal, to allow it, and just perhaps there might be a stray whale or something that gets netted once in a while, but when you've netted 3 whales in one opening, I think that's getting pretty outrageous. Well,
now, Ingmar, you mentioned that you don't like the GBR term, the Great Bear Rainforest, so much. Now, the GBR was created in a process that's still controversial, and this is this idea that environmental non-governmental organizations, or ENGOs, they took the position, and you see it commonly held today amongst the more prominent environmentalists, that they would engage with industry, that there would be a common table where industry and government and the environmental community, so-called, would sit around the table and make compromise and make deals. Where are we in that process in British Columbia?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say, because right after the very poor deal was negotiated, and it was a very secretive deal. It was negotiated behind closed doors without any interaction or consultation of any kind, and just suddenly announced out of the blue by Gordon Campbell and a bunch of charitable status guarding, bureaucratically organized environmental organizations. But subsequently, the price of lumber went down, and there was some kind of recession, and the demand for wood from British Columbia went way down, and logging dried up in the Central Coast area. Very little logging was going on. The only thing they were logging was cedar. So, just going after the cedar, you have to cut down everything else, and you just take the cedar out and leave the rest to rot. Well, the price of wood seems to be going up now, and we're starting to see more logging around our area. And, I've been talking to loggers that show up, and none of them's ever heard of EBM or anything like that. And from what I can see on the ground...
Or EBM, no, what's that?
Well, ecosystem-based management, right, that was supposed to be the deal, right? Well, in exchange for being allowed to log, you have to... observe these principles. And basically the principle of EBM is that if there, in nature, there are what we call stand replacing events where, fire, wind, bugs, or whatever it is, will level a tractive forest. So what happens is, just like a clear cut, the regenerated forest grows up in a single age stand closed canopy, much like would happen in any of the rest of the clear cutting that goes on in British Columbia. So they're saying, well, this isn't, clear cutting is something that can happen to a certain degree in the natural forest, right? So this is ecosystem-based management is supposed to log within that range of natural variability that where these kind of stand replacing events happen, right? So it's justified that way, but the amount of actual forest land that's protected in the Great Bear Rainforest is less than 30%. And
this is a great success now. This
has been trumped up as a huge agreement, and the corporate media is all over it. It sort of makes Canada look a little better in their mind, and people don't really understand the details of it. But less than 30% is actually protected from logging, and even that 30% allows for hydroelectric development, run of river, and mining, and all that sort of other stuff doesn't fall into those protections. And it's largely basically a greenwash scam. It allowed the government to look good. It helped re-elect Gordon Campbell. People like Forest Ethics went to the Great Copenhagen Climate Summit and elbowed their way through the literally tens of thousands of people that were demonstrating outside, elbowed their way through the crowd and got invited into the inner sanctum and actually presented a trophy to Gordon Campbell for his green leadership. This is a kind of terrible deal where so-called environmentalists enable the corporate system or the capitalist system to go into our resource areas and extract, because they say, well, in exchange for that, we've got these great protected areas. And I am very concerned that those kind of secretive negotiations are going on with the pipelines. I think, you look at the corporate media framing that's being built in British Columbia right now. I mean, we all know the Harper government's been very clear that it's in a push to forward their pipeline tanker project in British Columbia. And so they've invested, they're up front. There's $24 million in advertising that they're going to be telling the good story about pipelines and tankers. And we're starting to see this. You cannot pick up a Globe and Mail or a Times columnist or a Vancouver Sun or listen to the CBC without hearing that, we think that the opposition to the pipeline tankers is softening. People are starting to get on board. Alison Redford and Christy Clark are now buddies, and they've just got some minor details to work out. It's maybe how the revenue stream works. It's not royalties, because that's, you can't touch the royalties thing. And once we iron out those difficulties, everybody will be on board, and we can just go and punch the dirty oil pipeline through the coast and start slinging it out. And with tankers, and it's just this deeply insidious framing project to try and create the illusion of support for the pipelines. In my world, there's not a single person that I've met anywhere in my world, and I don't believe that I'm that exclusive. I don't believe that there is this parallel universe of people in British Columbia that are actually rah, let's bring it on, bring on the tankers. If there's an economic justification, I don't believe there is, but if Harper has in his mind a vision for Canada that says that the tar sands development and full-bore tar sands development and pipelines and tankers are essential for Canada's economic future. To me, I'm not an economist, but I'm saying if you want to make money out of the tar sands, let's make the real money. Build a 10-lane highway to Fort McMurray, bring all the industry there. You want to make widgets or whatever they make in China and stuff like that, just make it in Fort McMurray. I mean, Harper's bringing in Chinese labor and, Irish labor and all kinds of cheap labor into British Columbia because British Columbians don't want to work for $5 or $10 an hour or whatever. Bring them to Fort McMurray and make all the widgets there, That, to me, is how you build an economy. You don't just ship it all out as fast as possible. I mean, I've got children. Why would we just pump out all the oil and just ship it all over the world with all the, consequences, the ecological consequences of that? I'm appalled by the tar sands. I believe the Mackenzie River system is already severely damaged by it. It's the 10th largest watershed in the world. It goes all the way up to the Arctic. People are being sickened and with terrible cancers and tumors downstream from the tar sands. All the evidence is there that there's already horrific pollution going on in the Athabasca-Mackenzie River system. And so, what do you want to do? Do you want to destroy that and the BC coast to make your economic future for Canada?
It's not really an economic future for Canada, though. I think this is the issue. When you mentioned the Chinese
that's what
government,
the dialogue is, right?
Well, the Chinese government owns a huge piece of the tar sands, and it's the Chinese government that is pushing and expressing its discontent even now with the Harper government's lackadaisical, in their view, a prosecution of these pipelines, I'll put it, and putting up with any of, because the Chinese government certainly wouldn't put up with any of its own people standing in the way of big projects like this. It never has. Yeah. So, I mean, this is it, and this is a pipeline to Asia, because, as you say, they know you make your widgets at home, that's where you grow your economy, and that's what they're going to do, but they're going to do it with energy coming from here.
Yeah, it's just fraught with disaster, the whole idea. One of the, I believe, for one thing, I think there's a lot of thought that's gone into how we initiate these projects into our system. And I think the first thing we saw was Enbridge. And I'd be hard-pressed to believe that a corporation with a multi-million-dollar PR project, $100 million is the figure I've heard that came from unknown sources. They haven't divulged their sources of funding, but the Enbridge, the belligerence and stupidity of the Enbridge project, the way they launched it and tried to forcefully bludgeon it through, I don't believe that was just natural ignorance. I think there was a plan there to have it sort of like, well, maybe we can do this. We'll try to just force this through and then see what the result is. But that's really, I think, a diversionary tactic. I think the plan all along was to actually run it down the Kinder Morgan pipeline, the existing pipeline, and perhaps get the pipeline on beyond Vancouver down to Point Roberts or something, and have your tankers out there so the people of Vancouver don't have to look at them and get worried about them and all that sort of thing. But now you see that the Enbridge thing, some of the corporate media will say, well, that's a dead issue. It's not going to happen. People won't allow it. Kinder Morgan is where the traction is for them, but even Kinder Morgan's running into some opposition. So what do you hear now is, if we can't do the pipelines, we're going to run it through the railway. And so my feeling is, okay, yeah, you want to go ahead and build your $30 billion oil port in Prince Rupert, and we'll just see how far you get with your railway. No, everybody knows that's a non-starter. I mean, if anybody has driven along the Skeena River or lived up in that area, I mean, that railway is constantly going down due to landslides and avalanches and other issues. I mean, it just gets washed right down into the Skeena River. It is never going to happen. There's never going to be a oil port train car delivery to Prince Rupert. And so I think it's all like what they're saying is, well, if you don't want the pipelines, we're going to do it by rail. And now we're seeing all these rail disasters. We've got the Lake Megantic. I'm not so cynical as to believe that that was actually staged as a part of this process, like to emphasize the safety of oil pipelines. But now, just this morning, my son tells me there's been another train wreck in Edmonton, and there's big oil tankers on fire as we speak right now, and that sort of thing. When that starts happening, and I know there was one recently in Calgary and that sort of, it almost, I mean, I personally believe that 9/11 was a staged inside job from the neocon establishment to have a pretext to go and attack Iraq to steal their oil. And the whole Afghanistan thing is all about big oil. It's the fastest, shortest pipeline route from the Central Asian oil patch to the Arabian Sea. I don't believe I'm being cynical by saying 9/11 was an inside job. I certainly believe that. When you look at the evidence from 9/11, buildings falling down that didn't even get hit by airplanes, and how these buildings fall down into their own footprint, I would not put it past the neocon big oil corporate establishment to stage these massive events to get their to ram through their projects. So I look at the Edmonton train wreck of today and the kinds of train wrecks as kind of perhaps staged just to make those pipelines look a little more juicy,
Well, the train wreck is a good analogy. I mean, what we've done in this country and in the United States as well is allow infrastructure to deteriorate. And this is this short-term bottom line thinking where it's cheaper not to maintain something, and when it breaks, go in and fix it. Greg Palast, the great American journalist, talked about this with the so-called pig that they run through these pipelines. It's an automated, computer-generated machine that checks for weld integrity, but they turn the software off. They don't use it because it's too expensive to find mistakes that you're then obliged to fix. Better to let it go as long as possible before you have to daylight, which is digging up this pipeline. You mentioned Enbridge, yeah, they were ham-fisted in that, and it's a bit of a stalking horse perhaps. But yeah, as you say, it's not dead. But this Trans Mountain pipeline that's currently in use that Kinder Morgan bought a few years ago, they are running tar sands product down it over this very difficult terrain. David Ellis, a local guy, is going up there almost single-handedly and making this public. Yeah. He's a man with his hair on fire, but he says he's going to have to take hostages before he gets any media. Yeah. But this is the issue, and that's where Kinder Morgan wants to twin. Coming down over through hill and dale and under creeks and through rivers and everything else. But the pipeline they're running now is over 60 years old, and according to David Ellis, it's a wreck. It hasn't been maintained.
Yeah, there's people out there making bonfires on top of it. They've got their pumping stations with no locks on them, and anybody can go in there and start messing with the valves, and they're having leaks in the Coquihalla. There's leaks going on, and that's one of the things that I'd like to point out. I don't know how much time we've got left, but when you look at the oil spill recovery mandate for the British Columbia coast, okay, for the entire British Columbia coast, there's one single corporation, the Western Canada Marine Response Corporation. It's owned by a giant oil consortium of tar sands producers, Exxon, Chevron. I'm not sure the big four, but they're all the great big four oil companies that run this corporation that has the mandate to clean up oil spills for the entire BC coast. Now, this corporation has an objective that their task, their mandate is a 10,000 ton spill. Why 10,000 tons? I mean, these Aframax tankers and the Supermax tankers that they're planning to bring in here and that are already coming into Burrard Inlet are vastly bigger than 10,000 tons. So our world-class oil spill response, touted by Joe Oil Liver, the resource minister
Joe
or whatever.
Oliver, minister
when he was there in Vancouver with the backdrop of the Burrard Inlet and everything, touting the wonderful oil spill response, world class, they keep calling it. their flagship, the their flagship broke down on the way and couldn't even make it for the photo op. I mean,
well, it ran aground, as I recall, onto a sandbar or something like that, and it was empty.
Yeah. So now, currently, I'm aware of at least one 10,000-ton tanker that is plying the BC coast right through the inside waters, right past Quay, where I work, and Bella Bella, and all the way through up to Prince Rupert on a regular schedule. It's called Nathan E. Stewart is the tug, New York City registered, no flag. It pushes a barge, a 10,000-ton barge. It's got a notch in the back of it. The tug clamps on in the notch. It's got a great big tower that can see over the front. And it runs between Anacortes and like Cherry Point or whatever.
It's right down here.
Yeah, it runs between Alaska and Anacortes. No stops in Canada. So it offers nothing whatsoever to the people of Canada, and it's fraught with disaster. This barge tug combo 2 years ago got into a big storm off of Alaska, and both its engines were damaged by waves going down the funnels, and it became powerless, and had to issue a mayday call to the U.S. Coast Guard, and with great difficulty had to be towed into port, and it's a disaster waiting to happen. And I believe that 10,000-ton tanker's purpose for being permitted to run by the powers that be up our pristine coast right through the Great Bear Rainforest is part of the thing where the Harper government can say, well, there is really no tanker ban in British Columbia. We've been running these tankers up and down and never had a problem and that sort of thing. Well, that's a disaster waiting to happen, and I think people need to know about it.
Well, Ingmar, it's, if we're talking about conspiracies and stalking horses, maybe that'll be the tanker that spills, that kills everything, and then nobody cares anymore.
A 10,000-ton tanker will do a horrific amount of damage if it does have an accident. And this is the other thing about the world-class oil spill response mandate, is that they're already articulating what a successful recovery of oil looks like, and what the framing is now is that a successful recovery is somewhere about 10 to 15% of the oil. And we've seen you lick up the easy stuff, you get 10-15% of it, and it's like, okay, we've cleaned it up now, and we can just wait 10,000 years for the rest of it.
And the rest, as we saw in Alaska, stays in the environment. Yeah. Well, clearly, Ingmar, there's a lot more we could talk about, but sadly, on this issue of Face to Face, we have no more time. But thank you for joining me, Ingmar, and thank you for watching.